So let's start with the basics. You think that your life is the way that it is, that there are certain inalienable truths that just define and dictate who and how you are. Because we've all told ourselves a set of stories, and they're the inner narratives that explain everything to us, from why the sky is blue to why our spouse loves us. But there's one small part that perhaps you've never considered. You are creating those definitions. They are not determined from outside of you. So we stick with the narratives, the beliefs, the philosophies we've chosen for ourselves, either consciously or unconsciously, until they really don't work to define our lives, our experience, or our circumstances any longer. But usually it takes quite a bit of not working before we begin to budge on those understandings. And moreover, people don't think to change the explanatory model or the story. They think they need to change themselves. People allow what the world reflects back to them to be the definition then they embrace for themselves. So in this way, life is really the narrative you choose. And what you have to ask yourself is, what is the narrative I'm choosing for myself? I wasn't thinking about myself or my narrative in 1995, but I should have been, because I was in a mental hospital in Brattleboro, Vermont. I was 20 years old, severely anorexic, depressed, and often suicidal. I was going nowhere fast. And it wasn't until my parents came up for a meeting with a team of doctors that I wasn't invited to, that the lead doctor said to my parents that I could pretty much count on being in and out of mental hospitals for the rest of my life. This doctor thought she had seen this story before. And I don't think my mother was supposed to tell me that that was said, but she did. And something inside of me just woke up and came alive and said, oh no, that is not the story I choose for myself. That is not going to be me. And it was that punctuated understanding that I was infinitely powerful enough to just change the narrative of my life that eventually sent me towards yoga. Because I had had a first-hand experience of what the philosophy of the Tantra calls radical affirmation. And it's the idea that by our inherent nature, we say yes to life. It's the willingness to affirm ourselves and our understandings in the face of overwhelming dissent or denial. And lots of great beings have manifested this radical affirmation for themselves. In fact, I really believe in some level that greatness comes from rebuking the stories that others try to impose onto us. Take Sidney Poitier, who, at his first audition, the casting director told him to stop wasting everyone's time and to go get a job as a dishwasher. Or Oprah Winfrey, who was fired from her first television broadcasting job because she was, quote, unfit for the screen. Or Albert Einstein, he didn't speak until he was 4, nor did he read until he was 7, and his teachers actually labeled him slow and mentally handicapped. There were 22 other examples I found like this, but you get the picture. What if these people had embraced the stories other people gave to them, and yet we allow others to define us constantly? When I left residential treatment to return to university, I began studying Eastern philosophy and religion, and my studies finally brought me to the ashram of Guru Maya Chidvilasananda. And it was there that I first encountered the specific philosophy of the Tantra that so deeply corroborated these experiences I'd had of myself. Finally, there was a narrative that explained who I experienced myself to be. And in 1995, 2 million people worldwide were practicing yoga. But by 2011, 20 million people were now practicing yoga. So I think this matters insofar as yoga is a narrative, a story that more and more people are embracing all the time. So it ought to interest us, at least on some level, where those ideas that yoga derived from or came from. So yoga comes from a Sanskrit word that means to yoke, as in harnessing an animal to a plow or a cart. And in the analogy, the animal is like the untamed mind, the unconsciousness. It's just a beast that runs amok. And the reins are higher awareness, higher consciousness. So yoga then is the process of yoking higher awareness to any form of habit, impulse, or non-thinking. And it was definitely the method by which I first began to take conscious control of my life. So hours of daily meditating and being on the mat and doing hatha yoga at the ashram just brought me an exquisite inner recognition, really woke me up to the world. And it was that inner awareness that was so deeply different than the numbing of anorexia and depression. I just couldn't lie to myself anymore about what I was experiencing. Once I felt something, it was right there in front of me going forward. And it's that recognition inside that the Tantra calls pratyabhijna. So that's a word that means recognizing oneself at the deepest level as nothing other than a form of supreme consciousness, or what we could even call the divine. So Hatha Yoga, the kind of stretching in Sanskrit we get to see everywhere from Central Park to a local YMCA, derives from this fundamental and revelatory tantric idea that embodiment is purposeful, it's true, it's not any kind of mistake, and it's the veritable way that consciousness most deliberately chooses to become itself. And people think they're going to yoga for their hamstrings, they say they've got back pain, they're going to waylay anxiety, but I don't really think that's what keeps people doing yoga. They're recognizing something inside themselves that either they've never gotten in touch with before or they don't usually get to access. So the health club where I teach has windows that overlook the fitness floor, and I often think while I'm teaching, looking out those windows, I just don't think that enlightenment's going to show up on an elliptical machine. I mean, it could, but more like that. Cardio and other forms of exercise, they don't have these inherent philosophies, cosmologies, and latent spiritualities informing them. So even though now yoga is very secular, it still has this full impact of this history, this past, informing it. So people might get in the zone when they're running or exercising or working out, but they're not then offered an explicit framework in which to understand their experiences. So I really believe it's yoga's strong connection to philosophy that gives it its transformational power, its inspirational capacity, and that ultimately that's what's keeping people coming back to yoga. Otherwise, you could probably get a better workout on those elliptical machines. So Tantra is this highly sophisticated philosophy that yoga derives from in the first millennium in India. It's not this. If you Google it, you'll get an eyeful. And Tantra posits there's a supreme, unchanging, and unmanifest absolute consciousness out there, but that it self-consciously forgets that it is that infinite singularity in order to experience itself as the many, as everything else. So the manifest world, everything we see, is the phenomenon of the one having become everything. And that not only expresses itself as a universe, according to the Tantra, but a multiverse where multiple worlds can and do exist. So the absolute forgets itself on purpose and cloaks its own ability to remember in what's called a veil of Maya, or forgetfulness. And we usually think of forgetfulness as some kind of error or mistake. But in the Tantra, that obscuring is totally intentional and not a bit of a mistake. In fact, it's the mechanism by which the divine actually recognizes itself as anything other. It forgets it's it and says, oh, I'm you, I'm all of those things, but I'm not only this. So your consciousness and that of everything else then acts as a little mirror, reflecting glints of the divine back to itself over and over so that the divine experiences itself infinitely, one at a time. You then are that co-creator reflecting back the universe you make for yourself. And it's a multiverse of possibilities you could be constructing. Tantra looks at life as a supreme gift in which we get to do what the divine does and become ever more refined versions of ourselves. Tantra invites you to do the same. Recognize yourself as coextensive with the absolute and express yourself from that infinite rather than a limited perspective. It's within your power to create the unlimited story of your life, starting today.